Welcome to A Popular History of Unpopular Things, a mostly scripted podcast that tries to make history more fun and accessible. My kind of history is the unpopular stuff: disease, death, and destruction. I like learning about all things bloody, gross, mysterious, and weird. And today is a very special day for me because it is my 50th episode of AF Out. So to celebrate, I'm doing an episode on my favorite topic of all time. I've been talking it up, I've been promising it, and it's here: the Black Death. From roughly 1338 to 1353, the bubonic plague decimated populations in Europe, Asia, and the Middle East. Some areas were spared, like Poland and parts of today's Germany, while others saw mortality rates as high as 2/3. Overall, we historians estimate that approximately 1/3 of the populations of Europe, the Middle East, and Asia died as a result of the plague bacteria, Yersinia pestis, which had massive political, cultural, and economic consequences. So, in today's episode, I'm going to talk about all things Black Death. What is the plague? What are the symptoms? Where did plague come from? Where did they think plague came from? How did it spread? How did people try to prevent and or cure the plague? How did it end? And what were the long-term and short-term consequences? And has it ever come back in the same way it did during the canonical Black Death years? It's a lot of questions. It's a lot to cover today. So let's get started. First, let's do a little bit of terminology. When we use the phrase Black Death, we're really describing those particular years in the mid 14th century, that's the 1300s, when it spread from Asia to Europe. There have certainly been more outbreaks of plague in the years before and after, but we only refer to this one particular event as the Black Death. Side note, they didn't call it the Black Death in the 1300s. The term Black Death was coined in the mid 18th century, so that's the 1700s. So it was called a whole bunch of other things in the 14th century. But the one that stuck was Magna Mortalitas, or the Great Mortality. I've also heard the Great Pestilence or the Great Plague, but Great Mortality is the one that usually sticks. So the disease at the heart of the Black Death was bubonic plague, caused by a little bacteria known as Yersinia pestis. It's a cute, cylindrical-shaped little doodad that is endemic to a handful of areas in the world, including Central Asia, which is where the strain of Yersinia pestis that became the Black Death originated. But just know that it's also endemic to a lot of other places, including parts of the western United States, and can be carried by cute little fuzzy baby animals like prairie dogs. So don't cuddle wild animals or eat them, and you should be fine. Now, when you come in contact with enough Yersinia pestis bacteria, you contract the plague. It can happen in four main ways. You can be bitten from an infected flea that is carrying plague bacteria. You can get it from direct contact with infected tissues or pus from somebody with the plague. If it's pneumonic, then it can be spread through the air and you breathe it in. Or in some cases, it can be septicemic, which means you get it from contaminated blood. Plague symptoms include a fever that can go up to 105, convulsions, vomiting, sweating, but you get that with a lot of bacterial infections, right? It's your body's way of fighting things off. The characteristic symptom of a plague infection is a painful swelling in your lymph nodes, particularly the ones in your neck, your underarm, or your groin. And they are purplish black swellings known as buboes, and they can grow to the size of an egg or an apple. Oh, can you imagine? So one thing you can do to visualize this is take your hand, make a fist, and imagine a lump that big growing out of your neck or your underarm, filled with bacterial pus. Gross. And don't listen. I know that I just brought props into this, but I used to be a teacher, okay? It's what I do. So, the term bubonic and bubonic plague does come from those buboes, those characteristic lumps that are a dead giveaway for having plague. Now, as I'm sure I've gone over many times in previous disease episodes, since Yersinia pestis is a bacteria, it can survive in the wild on its own. It's a living organism. It doesn't need a host to survive like a virus does, but it certainly can and does live in host creatures like the aforementioned prairie dogs or marmots or rats. So then, the next question is, how did it spread to Europe? Well, the real answer is trade. Trade is usually the answer for why things happen, but there's a lot more to this story. And to get the proper historical context, we actually need to talk about the Mongols. Genghis Khan became the leader of the consolidated Mongol clans in 1206. Prior to this, the Mongols stayed in family or kinship groups, often warring with each other. But Genghis Khan, a visionary, saw a chance to unite his people under one banner and grow their empire. Now, you know me. I crave context. Why 1206? Why that period of time? Why not earlier? Why not later? Why this dude, right? Like, it's a very specific moment in history, and I want to know why it was that moment. Well, part of it was the man himself, but a big reason was actually the medieval warming period. Between the years 900 and 1300, global temperatures were on average higher than in the centuries before and after. And in fact, after the medieval warming period, we actually get the Little Ice Age, but that's an unnecessary tangent. Look, I'm showing restraint. It's been 50 episodes and I'm learning. The bigger point here is that during the medieval warming period, as things were on average much hotter, the pastoral nomadic Mongols had a hard time living their normal pastoral way of life, following their grazing animals around, surviving on their milk, their meat, and their blood. As grasses died off with higher temperatures, so did their livestock. But you know who was having a great time with lots of agriculture and rice and food and no problems whatsoever? China, to the south. Once Genghis Khan gained control of the Mongols, he turned his sights towards the Sung dynasty in China. And a long story short and simplified here because the Mongols are not the main point of today's story, they ended up conquering a landmass of over 9 million square miles from China and Korea in the east to parts of Eastern Europe and the Middle East in the west. And it was the largest contiguous land empire in history. And I cannot foresee anyone ever having an even larger land empire than that. So put them in the Guinness Book of World Records. They win. Mongols win. Okay. Genghis Khan did die before the empire reached its height, but his sons and grandsons carried on and grew the empire even more after his death. I did an episode on a particularly brutal descendant of the Mongols and the Turks, a man named Timur Ilang, so go check out that episode when you're done here. Now, stay with me. I promise this is all relevant to plague in Europe. When most people think of the Mongols, they think of destruction, death, war, horseback archers, pillaging of cities, piling skulls into pyramids, all the brutal aspects of war. Fair enough, I get it. But in truth, pretty much every warring medieval society or empire was built on brutality and bloodthirstiness, Christian Europeans included. So, I mean, think about the Crusades, right? So, I tend to look at their greatest positive legacy, which was trade. The Mongols, as nomadic peoples, relied on trade to survive. Without it, they would not have gotten the things they needed to continue their pastoral nomadic lifestyle. You can't get everything you need to survive just off of grazing animals in the steppes of Mongolia, right? So, when they conquered a massive empire that encapsulated the entirety of the Silk Road's trading network, at least the land routes, they did everything they could to ensure safe trade for merchants of all countries and religions. The famous merchant everybody thinks of course, is Marco Polo, the Venetian merchant who is sometimes credited with being the first European to travel throughout China, though there is a possibility that he never actually went to Asia and borrowed stories from other merchants. But I'll leave that for other historians to tackle. Now, the Mongols did a lot of things to ensure peace, and their relatively peaceful rule once the empire was established was known as the Pax Mongolica, Mongol peace. They issued passports called paisas to ensure safe passage for merchants. Highwaymen, bandits, thieves, they would be killed if caught, and nobody wanted to face the wrath of the Mongols. There were rest stops, if you want to call them that, spaced throughout the empire on the Silk Roads with fresh horses and food and water and trading opportunities, you name it. So towns and cities that were already big trading centers grew even larger and more important than before. Think Isfahan in Iran, or Baghdad, or Constantinople, which of course is today's Istanbul. My main point here is that the Mongols valued trade. So, trade grew, and with greater and greater frequency. More things were flowing back and forth east to west than ever before. This led to the spread of goods, of ideas, of religions, of people, but it also led to the spread of disease, because the more you come in contact with people and things, the more you transfer germs back and forth. And this is how plague spreads from a small village in Central Asia along the Silk Roads to China and also Europe in the West. Traditionally, historians believe that the plague began somewhere in China, likely on the Mongolian Chinese border. The first known death from plague during the Black Death was in Issyk Kul, a lake in today's Kyrgyzstan on the Silk Road's trade network, and we assumed that it traded there from a pocket of endemic plague on that Chinese-Mongolian border. But in 2022, genetic research identified that the strain of Yersinia pestis that became the Black Death originated at Issyk Kul, which is super fascinating because this research shed new light on the true origins of the Black Death and how it spread. Science and history together is just a really awesome thing. And I love that we're still discovering new things about the Black Death, even as recent as 2022. But how it spread is still more or less the same. Rodents can naturally carry plague. The historic rodent scapegoat was the black rat, which is known to carry rat fleas, which can spread the plague. But it was more likely the marmot that was carrying plague bacteria. And for those of you who have never seen a marmot before, a groundhog is a type of marmot. And I wanted to see how the internet defined a marmot, so I Googled it, and Google told me that it is a large ground squirrel, which is a really funny description to me. But anyway, to keep it simple, marmots can be plague hosts. Fleas are the vector. They bite the marmot and they suck up some of the plague infested blood. And then, if they jump to humans, when fleas bite humans, they vomit all of their blood inside the human and take fresh blood. So, boom, you've now got plague bacteria from the marmot transferred into their new host, which is you. You can also get plague from eating raw marmot meat if that marmot has plague bacteria in it, right? So don't do that. That happened a couple of years ago. It felt like a couple of years ago, but it was probably pre-pandemic. That happened with a Mongolian couple. They ate raw marmot meat and they got plague, right? So, don't do that. There are other ways of getting plague, though, from marmots and other infected rodents, but that's not important. Just in general, don't approach wildlife and handle it, and you won't get sick. That's simple, right? And a mini tangent, sorry, maybe I'm not learning as much as I thought. Armadillos can carry leprosy. So don't go around handling armadillos unless you know what you're doing, just in case. Just don't go touching wild creatures. Anyways, trade is alive and well during the Pax Mongolica, and people and goods are moving back and forth east to west through trading towns like the settlement on Lake Issyk Kul. And this means that the fleas infected with plague are also moving around. And it wasn't just restricted to land. Rats, rodents, and their fleas also found their way aboard trading ships. And in fact, the first instance of plague in Europe was at an Italian port in Sicily at Messina. Now, there was a source that claimed that the Mongols intentionally flung plague bodies over the wall at Kaffa, which is a port on the Black Sea, which would be an example of biological warfare. And it's a really cool source, and I used to use it in my classroom because it's really cool, but with the caveat, both then and now, that it is the only source of its kind, so it cannot be corroborated, which means it may not be real, and we need to take it with a grain of salt. But here's an excerpt from that source anyway, because again, it's really cool and it's kind of gross. It comes from a Genoese scholar named Gabriel de Musis, who wrote, quote, "In 1346, in the countries of the East, countless numbers of Tartars and Saracens, that's Mongols and Muslims respectively, were struck down by a mysterious illness which brought sudden death. These countries, broad regions, far spreading provinces, magnificent kingdoms, cities, towns, and settlements, ground down by illness and devoured by dreadful death, were soon stripped of their inhabitants. The Christian merchants, who had been driven out by force, were so terrified of the power of the Tartars that, to save themselves and their belongings, they fled in an armed ship to Kaffa. Oh God, see how the heathen Tartar races, pouring together from all sides, suddenly infested the city of Kaffa and besieged the trapped Christians there for almost 3 years. But behold, the whole army was affected by a disease which overran the Tartars and killed thousands upon thousands every day. The dying Tartars ordered corpses to be placed in catapults and lobbed into the city in the hope that the intolerable stench would kill everyone inside. What seemed like mountains of dead were thrown into the city, and the Christians could not hide or flee or escape from them, although they dumped as many of the bodies as they could into the sea. And soon the rotting corpses tainted the air and poisoned the water supply. Moreover, one infected man could carry the poison to others and infect people and places with the disease by look alone. End quote. De Musis goes on to suggest that the merchants, panicked and infected with plague, got on ships and fled to Italy, which is how it spread there. And while the plague did spread to Italy from a boat, there is no evidence to suggest that the Mongols engaged in this biological warfare at Kaffa. It's more likely that the merchants themselves were carrying rat fleas in their cloth, in their linens, and the things that they were buying and selling, and brought that with them back to the port. And in fact, even though de Musi seems to claim here that he was there at Kaffa and saw this happen, it's possible he was actually in Italy during the entire invasion. I've seen historians claim that this account is plausible and likely correct, but others saying that it's exaggerated. So again, we need to take this source with a grain of salt, because there isn't much to corroborate it. But regardless, the imagery of plague infested bodies like flying over the walls and rotting in the cities and getting people sick is pretty gross and therefore super cool. But regardless of the exact method by which merchants brought the plague to Europe, it did arrive at Messina, a Sicilian port, right? And then it spread north throughout Europe from there. Now, here's a fascinating source from Agnolo di Turra from Siena, Italy, who witnessed the plague firsthand. Quote, "The mortality began in Siena in May 1348. It was a cruel and horrible thing, and I do not know where to begin to tell the cruelty and the pitiless ways. The victims died almost immediately. They would swell beneath their armpits and in their groins and fall over dead while talking. Father abandoned child, wife abandoned husband, one brother abandoned another, and none could be found to bury the dead for money or friendship. Members of a household brought their dead to a ditch as best they could, without priest, without last rites, nor did the death bell sound. And in many places in Siena, great pits were dug and piled deep with the multitude of dead. And I, Agnolo di Turra, buried my 5 children with my own hands. And there were also those who were so sparsely covered with earth that dogs dragged them forth and devoured many bodies throughout the city. There was no one who wept for any death, for all awaited death. And so many died that all believed that it was the end of the world." End quote. I love that source. It's a classic plague source. Love it. Now, other similar sources, of which there were many, by the way, describe plague in the same ways, those characteristic buboes, the absolute chaos that ensued. But it's also worth noting that not everyone responded to the Black Death this way. For Christians, the plague was seen as a punishment from God. They must have been doing something wrong to receive his wrath in that way, and some acted accordingly. There were bands of Christians who were flagellants and would whip themselves in penance, hoping God would save them from the onslaught of plague. Other Christians went the opposite way, forsaking their religion because clearly their God had forsaken them. A source from 1350 by the English chronicler William Dean notes that, quote, "The people, for the greater part, became ever more depraved, more prone to every vice, and more inclined than ever before to evil and wickedness, not thinking of death, nor of the past plague, nor of their own salvation. The laborers and skilled workmen were imbued with such a spirit of rebellion that neither king, law, nor justice could curb them." End quote. Muslims, on the other hand, generally believed and behaved the opposite of their Christian counterparts. One 1364 source from Muhammad al-Manbiji states, and a short quote here, prayer for lifting the epidemic is abhorrent because plague is a blessing from God. At the least, a Muslim should devoutly accept the divine act. End quote. And instead of either blaming God or turning away from him, multiple sources suggest that Muslims instead increased their devotions and prayers. I'm not going anywhere with this. I just thought it was an interesting difference between the two. So, as you probably gathered, most believe the plague to be either a gift or a curse from God. Consider that this is not a world wholly based in science or germ theory yet, right? They would have no idea about germs or bacteria or any of those things. If you've listened to a bunch of my episodes, then you know that germ theory didn't really come about until the mid 19th century. That's the mid 1800s. So, if that's the case, then how did the medieval world handle prevention and cures? For the remainder of this episode, I'm going to be focusing on the plague in Europe and more specifically Britain because that's what I'm more familiar with and that's what my studies are in. Now, my first question is this: how did the contemporary medieval peasant, or more broadly the town, try to prevent the plague? Most believed that it came from God, right? So, apart from being more pious, what did they think would save them? And what's fascinating about this is what we learn from their beliefs in sanitation and health based on their actions. Now, one thing you might already know about this period of time, if you've been listening to my stuff, is the idea of miasma theory. It's become one of my favorite words. The briefest of recaps for those of you who are new to the show: miasma theory is the idea that bad, stinky air, called miasma, causes disease. So, some of their preventatives involved cleaning or purifying the air. Here are some examples of preventions and or cures that align with the miasma theory. Break up the air inside your home by ringing bells and releasing birds, and then chasing them so they fly around the room. Do not bathe, for this opens your pores to the air. The thought being, of course, that miasma will then get into your body through those big old, clean, open pores, and you're going to get sick and die. Burn aromatic wood throughout your home. Periodically throw in a powdered mixture of sulfur and arsenic on your fire, which is exactly what you would want to smell in your cramped, squalid little home. The smell of burning rotten eggs. That's disgusting. Pile sweet smelling shrubs around the boundaries of cities. And finally, for this part of the list, fill your house with pleasant smelling flowers sprinkled with vinegar and rose water. Okay, you see what I mean, right? These are all rooted in the idea that miasma caused plague, and so therefore make it so you aren't smelling the bad stuff or are breaking up the air so the miasma is dispersed. We see that in suggestions like having birds fly around your home to keep the air moving, or having heavily scented things in your home like burning wood or flowers. And this perpetuates the idea that smelling good things keeps you healthy. And this wasn't just limited to peasant homes. Doctors at the time thought the same things. Enter the plague doctor. He's a cute little guy. When most of us think of the plague doctor, we think of the long black trench coat and the creepy bird mask, right? It's an image you see anywhere now. You can even get cute, squishy ones like this. You hang out there. They've been turned into SCP monsters. Did he just... Oh my god, he fell. It was the miasma. Okay, we good. You can, where was I? SCP monsters, right? You've seen plague doctors as SCP monsters. You can see their masks and bird beak style masks in Carnival and other kinds of, you see them in movies, right? They're all over the place. The reason for that characteristic mask is to ward away miasma. The long beak-like nose would be stuffed with flowers and herbs to keep the miasma away so the doctor could do his work. However, sorry to be the bearer of bad news here, the archetypal plague doctor was not around during the Black Death. The earliest recorded use of a plague doctor using some kind of mask stuffed with flowers and herbs can be traced back to 1373, which is well after the Black Death ended. And typical imagery of the plague doctor we actually use comes from a 17th century epidemic, that's the 1600s. So unfortunately, no creepy plague doctor masks during the Black Death. However, what we can say about the maskless plague doctors during the Black Death is that they equally did not understand the cause of the plague, and their ideas about the four humors and how the body worked actually made things worse. For more information about the four humors and that theory on medicine, check out other episodes where I went into more detail about it: the London cholera epidemic, dancing plague, corpse medicine, Victorian houses of death, although I think I probably go into the most detail in the corpse medicine episode. But anyway, here's how plague doctors treated their patients: they purged the body with laxatives, draw off impure or excessive blood by bleeding, drink a syrup of roses mixed with powdered coral, precious stones, and bones from the heart of a stag to strengthen the heart. It's a weird one. Oh, here's a great one. Put an old rooster cut through the back to flatten it, or a poultice of mustard and lily bulbs right on the buboes. Because that's what you want to do, right? You want a rotten old rooster carcass right on your open wound. Cover buboes with clay. Sear the buboes with a red hot iron. And my last one for this list: cut open and drain the buboes, treating them like ulcers. And of course, none of these are going to work. We know that plague is a bacterial infection. So, in the modern age, if your body can't fight it off alone, you take antibiotics. But antibiotics aren't anywhere close to being discovered yet. So, based on the limited medical knowledge medieval doctors had, these were their best remedies: balancing the four humors. But doing things like lancing and slicing open buboes or branding your infected lymph node with a hot iron is only going to spread plague, pus, and bacteria everywhere, or allow more bad bacteria to get into your body from the wound that you just created for no reason. And doctors were more likely just going to bring all of your plague, pus, bacteria from one patient, from you, to somebody else anyway, so worthless. And let's also add into the fact that medieval homes and towns were dirty. Sanitation was just not present. The streets were caked in filth. There was animal blood and guts and excrement. There was human blood and urine and excrement. It's just nasty, right? And super packed with people. The rise in trade meant more jobs, which meant more money. And when there is a stable economy, we often see populations rise. So there are tons of people crammed into tiny, dirty spaces, the perfect breeding ground for disease. And rats, which carry rat fleas, which can spread the disease. This allows it to spread even faster. And then in some cases, it will also become pneumonic, right? It will spread through the air. So it can be coughed up and others are going to respirate it and they would get plague that way. And pneumonic plague has a much higher mortality rate than bubonic plague. And as we know, up to 1/3 of Europe's population died. In some towns like Siena, 60% or more of the population died from plague. And those figures are similar for the Middle East and Asia as well, anywhere that the plague spread. I do need to mention, however, that it's likely that not all of the deaths during the peak plague years were actually from plague. There are some that suggest that either smallpox or anthrax might have killed some of the population because it was similar enough to the plague and it killed at the same time, but in church registers it was just written down as pestilence, right? This is more than likely. More than likely. But still, there's no denying that plague had a massive impact on the population. So, with all of this death and destruction, fear and chaos, what did life look like during the plague years? In addition to the religious confusion I mentioned before, life in the plague years was rough on the survivors. With an average of 1/3 of the population dead, social, political, and economic systems were crippled. I'm not going to get too deep into the medieval feudal system, but essentially, with so many peasants dying from plague, there were few left to keep the farms running. And by the way, it wasn't just peasants that died, anybody was susceptible. There was even an English princess, I believe her name was Joan, who died of plague. She was on her way to go marry, I think, the Spanish prince, and then she died. It was a whole political problem. But anyway, it was mostly peasants that died because of their living conditions. And because so many of them were dead, there was a serious food shortage. And those left had to do all of that extra work, insisted that they get paid properly for the extra work they were doing, which would have completely upended the entire premise of the feudal system. Now, one source that gives us some good information on this is the 1349 Ordinance of Laborers from England. And in it, the king essentially puts laborers to work with wages to be paid in pre plague levels to ensure that they were getting paid fairly and properly for their work, to encourage them to work, and also punish those who refused to work even if they were able to do so. Now, as a historian, this tells me that there was clearly a labor issue if the king had to issue an ordinance to deal with it. But it didn't really solve the problem, because decades later, in 1381, there was a massive peasant revolt and it helped speed up the end of the medieval feudal system. All of this a long term consequence of the Black Death on population levels, the economy, and society as a whole. But one of the more distressing things that came from the Black Death is actually wrapped up in religion and what some Christians thought caused the plague. Many of them blamed the Jews. The best example we have of this is the Strasbourg massacre, which took place on Valentine's Day in 1349. Some couldn't fathom the idea that their god would deliberately punish them with plague, so instead they looked to a scapegoat. Somebody must be poisoning the wells, making people sick. And historically, Jewish populations in Europe have been blamed for things that went wrong or were unexplainable. It certainly didn't help that a man was tortured into confessing to poisoning the wells. Adjumet of Geneva. On October 20th, 1348, he confessed to putting poison in several places, like the Toulouse public fountain, and a source detailing the confession tells us that, quote, Adjumet the Jew, who lived at Geneva and was arrested at Châtel, was put to the torture a little and then was released from it. And after a long time, having been subjected again to torture a little, he confessed. End quote. And then the source details his confession. But I mean, he was tortured into it. There's no actual proof that the wells were poisoned. This is just a case of people not knowing what was happening and casting the blame on scapegoats. The end result of this was about 2,000 Jews were rounded up and gathered in Strasbourg. 1,000 of them were spared because they got baptized and renounced their faith, but 1,000 of them were burned to death. Their property and assets were taken and given to non-Jewish populations about town. And this happened in other towns too, but the incident at Strasbourg is pretty heavily documented, so it's a good example of what was happening. And in fact, things were so bad that the Pope had to step in and make a statement. Pope Clement VI on July 5th, 1348 wrote that, quote, Since this pestilence is all but universal everywhere, and by a mysterious decree of God has afflicted and continues to afflict both Jews and many other nations throughout the diverse regions of the earth, to whom a common existence with the Jews is unknown, the charge that Jews have provided the cause of this occasion for such a crime is without plausibility. End quote. In short, the plague is killing Jews as much as it's killing Christians, so it's not plausible to say the Jews are the reason why plague is happening. Now, curiously, there are some areas that were spared from plague. For example, when we look at a map of the spread of plague in Europe, starting in Italy, working its way north, there is a little circle around Poland and eastern parts of today's Germany where the plague apparently didn't spread. But it got to the other side of that and infected Russian cities, so what gives? The most plausible explanation is the geography of that area. The Carpathian Mountains likely slowed down the movement of trade and infected people from entering the general area. The population was also much lower there than it was in the cramped towns in Western and Southern Europe, so there were fewer incidences of infected people rubbing up on each other and sharing germs. The parts of Poland that did contract the plague were not protected by the mountains. So, as is usually the case, the physical geography here matters. It's the same with the spread of plague from its origin at Issyk Kul. It went east and west, but not too far to the south. The Himalaya mountains more or less prevented the plague, and also the Mongols, frankly, from spreading to India and further south. In later epidemics, like the one in the 19th and early 20th centuries in India, it was industrialization and steamships that brought plague to the subcontinent, not caravans or traders on land by the Silk Road. So I think it's safe to say that the Black Death had a huge impact on Europe, both short term and long term. In the short term, it wipes out a good chunk of the population. And in fact, England's population only reached pre plague levels again in the mid 1500s. That's around 200 years later. That's wild. It took 2 centuries for the population to recover. That's how many died. I mean, it's crazy. Huge, huge amount of death. And as I went over earlier, this drop in population had really big ramifications for life in the traditional medieval feudal system. Without peasants to support the knights, the nobles, the clergy, there was no food. Without them, the whole system crumbled. The Black Death was a huge part of its decline towards the tail end of the medieval period. That and access to trade in general, which offered more jobs and opportunities in cities so that people could better themselves because you know, a lack of social mobility in the feudal system wasn't really helpful. It just forced peasants to live under their liege lord and pretty much be born and die on the same plot of land for their entire life. Not fun. The years of plague's greatest impact in Europe were between 1347 and 1351, though it did continue to spread east into Russia until 1353. It eventually ended, in part because it had already swept through most of the population, and those who contracted it and survived had a better shot of fighting it off in the future. But also, quarantining helped. Those who were not infected would stay in their homes and wait it out. Those with money moved to less densely populated areas and lived in isolation until the plague swept through. Time was also helpful. Colder weather killed off the fleas that served as the primary vector for plague bacteria. But while the Black Death did eventually end in the mid 14th century, the plague bacteria, of course, survived. Remember, it doesn't need a host like a virus does to survive, and there have been several epidemics in the years since. I would argue that there are 3 great plague pandemics in history. The first recorded plague pandemic was the plague of Justinian, which ravaged the Byzantine Empire centered around Constantinople in 541. The Black Death is the second. A quick honorable mention goes to the Great Plague of London, 1665 to 1666, which killed over 68,000 people in the span of a year, which is about 1/5 of the city's population. It ended, in part, thanks to the Great Fire of London in 1666, which killed off many of the rats and the fleas and the filth spreading the plague. I'm going to be doing that episode soon, don't you worry. But since this was more or less confined to just London and its surrounding areas, it doesn't count as a pandemic. I just wanted to mention it because it's cool. And it was a pretty big deal regardless. The third Great Plague pandemic began in China in 1894, then spread to Hong Kong, then India, and then everywhere else in the late 1800s, early 1900s. More than 12 million people died in India and China alone, and death tolls are estimated at 15 million worldwide. It doesn't really compare to the Black Death's estimated death toll, which sits somewhere between 25 and 50 million. But considering how much better medical science was in the late 1800s, early 1900s, 15 million is still a huge figure. And for a number and size reference for those of us living in the 21st century, the death toll for the COVID pandemic sits currently at just over 7 million. So just gives you an idea of the scale of the pandemic, the third Great Plague pandemic anyway. Because of how much the world changed as a result of the Black Death, you've got new sanitation measures like quarantining, the decline of the feudal system, and the impact on local economies, it remains one of those topics that people still love to learn about, myself included, right? It's my favorite topic of all time. And new discoveries are still being made, like the research that came out in 2022 with proof that plague actually began at Issyk Kul, which is incredibly exciting for historians like me who love this stuff. And who knows what we're going to find out in the years to come. But studying disease history like this is a way of studying how our world has changed over time and how one little bacterium, like the cute little cylindrical Yersinia pestis, can completely change our world. Thank you for joining me for this episode of A Popular History of Unpopular Things. My name is Kelly Beard, and I hope you've enjoyed the story of the Black Death. Thank you for supporting my podcast, and if you haven't already checked out my other episodes, go have a listen. You can also support me and the show on Patreon. Just look up A Popular History of Unpopular Things and subscribe to F Out on YouTube. You should also go check out Nedrick Music, who's the musician behind my intro and outro song. Be sure to listen to my podcast, available wherever you listen, so you know when new episodes are dropped. And stay tuned to get a popular history of unpopular things. And thanks for helping me celebrate my 50th episode.